I've made the bold decision to turn my notes into a book. Yeah. I'm going to make a book called Everything You Need to Know About the Ego. And I'll be able to expand on things that have not been able to teach in the class. And you're welcome to ask questions tonight as we go, but I might just say, read the book. Yeah, it's been really an amazing journey the last few weeks, but also brewing this idea of the ego for actually quite a few years. You might call it a study in egoity, or I heard someone call it egosophy, the wisdom of the ego. And I'm trying to frame the ego in a positive light over the duration of this class, because it's often villainized with book titles like Kill the Ego, Your Ego is Not Your Friend, etc. And in the class, I explained, why that perception of the ego has become such. And so I've been trying to, in a way, redeem the ego back to really a positive central feature to our total makeup as a being of body, soul, and spirit. And that it's an important, very important aspect of our makeup. It was never looked at as a negative thing by Freud, who, was working with the idea of the ego and the id and the superego, or Jung, or Rudolf Steiner. In Western psychology, it's not viewed as something you want to get rid of. There was a fork in the road when Eastern teachers started to use the word ego to refer to something of a false self, something that was undesirable in the human psyche, and that it needed to be gotten rid of, to be dissolved. But they were really referring to something else. That Sanskrit term is amhata, and the Buddhists have a term for false self and whatnot. But what we came to over the 7 sessions is that the ego is really at the center of the self as an impulse towards awakening to the self, to evolve the self, and to, from that, create greater connections with the other than the self. And really the only problem with the ego is when it becomes diseased. We had a whole session talking about the diseases of the ego, which we could refer to as egotism, the egotisms of the ego. And we looked at a whole bunch of different conditions, including narcissism and so forth, that are diseased states of the ego. But it's actually not even the ego that's diseased, it's just the environment that it's in that leads to abnormalities and imbalances really in the mind. And that's where the problem is. It's in the mind. So, we already addressed a little bit about the idea of dissolving the ego and how that term is thrown around, and in the shamanistic world and so forth, to dissolve the ego, get rid of the ego, and so forth. But we really looked at not about dissolving the ego, but evolving the ego, to evolve it to a different state than it is as a diseased and imbalanced feature within the core of your being. And this really touches on the thing of free will, which is, of course, a question a lot of people have. Do I have free will? And we'll see how far we can get into that tonight. But we can say you do have freedom of will in what you do with your ego, and how you become a self-stylizing, evolutionary, loving fashionista. Certainly, there are aspects of our nature that are not within the domain of free will. I mean, you can talk about DNA and genetics and things like that, but even now epigenetics is saying, oh, no, you have power to exercise your will and bring about changes in your nature. There's socialization and other things. People would say, well, you're really just programmed. You don't have freedom of will. But what we've been saying is that there is a small part underneath it all where freedom of will can be exercised. And when we develop that small part, it becomes a bigger part. The more we manifest freedom of will, the more we will manifest freedom. Freedom of will exercise will lead to freedom, true freedom. Because the default is that we're not free. We are, in a way, programmed or slaves to biology or this or that or the other thing. So it's really through the development and evolving of the ego that we're going to experience more of that power of freedom of will. And so it's not so much about dissolving, but learning to take it through ego death, which is the first part of the talk. But what is the other side of death? Birth, right. So we're going to talk about ego death. We have to talk about birth, rebirth, something arising on the other side. And that's what the Greeks called enantiodromia. Enantiodromia. You go so far in a certain direction and then it turns and it goes back in the opposite direction. You move towards death. It's going to bring you towards life. And so to talk about the use of psychoactive substances and what goes on there, we have to realize that shamanism, and we've talked about shamanism and Neo-Shamanism. What is Neo-Shamanism? That means new, a new form of shamanism, because we've been talking about a picture of spiritual evolution, that there has been a spiritual evolution taking place. That's a main tenet of the work, that things have not been static in one place, but there's been a spiritual evolution that is an evolution of consciousness. It's about evolution of consciousness. And this physical evolution that we see and science sees and categorizes. So the evolution of consciousness has been paralleled by a physical evolution. And we could say the physical evolution of things is facilitating evolution of consciousness. It's supporting the evolution of consciousness. The consciousness as a spiritual thing, it's not physical, it's a spiritual thing, manifests into a physical state, somewhat like water turns into ice. And then like ice that melts, it returns back to a liquid state. Again, we're seeing enantiodromia, this going in different directions. So spiritual consciousness creating physical form and then going back into a spiritualized state. Why? So that there can be the development of consciousness. And we see that. We see that the physical world really facilitates waking up. It's like, if I pushed you like that, it's like, that would kind of wake you up, Or if I walked into a wall, I'd go, oh, wow, that's my physical body and that's a wall, right? Wake up, So the material world is facilitating awakening of consciousness. That's its purpose and its service. And this evolution of consciousness, just to recap very briefly, what we learned about Carl Jung's idea of the different stages of brain orientation, where primitive people were more in the right side of the brain, more of that intuitive dream time type of experience, where they were merged with nature. There was very little boundary between the mind of primitive people and nature. And that's, you look culturally at nature religions like Shintoism, where the wind speaks, the Kama speaks, and the water speaks. So then, from primitive to the ancient people, there began to be an awakening of the left side. And that might have been, as Graham Hancock says, because they were discovering mushrooms and eating them. And it's like, whoa, something's waking up in my here and here. And so this shift towards the left, and then the third step, the modern human being, who is more, we are more, left brain dominant, where we have analytical thinking, logical thinking, and objectification of nature, where it's like, I'm the scientist and that's a tree, and I'm going to cut it down and kill it and measure, name it, tell it what it is. And, that's given birth to science, this shift to the left side, but it's also facilitated the birthing of the ego. So with this evolution of consciousness, there's been a gradual evolution of ego, which is the part that, has this capacity for objectification. Like, here's me and there's you, right? And I'm Jesse and you're Mario, right? So that's where we are right now in our highly scientific culture. And how Jung is talking about the contemporary human being now coming into a balance of the left and the right, the capacities for analytical, logical access, and the right that has more intuitive access, coming together in a contemporary human being, which I'm using the acronym NEAM. NEAM meaning the newly emerging hybridized human mind. And it's not only just about bringing two together, but out of two is born a third. Something is being birthed in the human. And we've been brought to this point, but now it's really up to us to be the midwives of this third thing that's emerging out of the middle, the NEAM, the newly emerging hybridized human mind. So having said that, we can now start to look at shamanism from primitive times. It's really something that goes back, well, can't even really quantify how far it goes back, but it was, shamanism is the ability to go beyond just the realm of the senses. And the senses are designed to be oriented to this dimension, the physical dimension. So the use of psychoactivating substances activated things in the psyche in the people of the past. And it was actually quite easy to do because the ego was not so mature and developed in the primitive people, as we've just seen. The ego came on gradually as a central force. In the primitive people, they were more diffuse, tribal oriented in this group soul and group mind. So I have a book here that is written by a spiritual scientist, In the Place of the Self. It's called In the Place of the Self, How Drugs Work. And he's addressing this, and how it's affecting the modern human being, because when you are working with psychoactive substances, it's not just a chemical thing. If you really expose yourself to shamanism, as I did for a time when I went down to Peru about 10 years ago, and I did a season of ayahuasca journeys. I did 10 of them in 2 weeks. Don't recommend it. It was, doing spiritual scientific research, and as Ping, experienced, every night was a different thing. And sometimes it was like Halloween for adults. But, overall there was value. And when I came back, I found a Shipibo trained shaman here in Toronto and did 10 more. I did like 20 altogether over 6 months. And then it's like, okay, I think I get an idea what's going on here. But yeah, as this title suggests, in place of the self, what is in place of the self? Well, it's not just chemical. You're dealing with plant spirit beings. They are plant spirit beings that have, a spiritual essence of their own that is administered to you by the shaman, that comes in, and you really go under the influence of another being. And for primitive people, as I said, they weren't so strong in their ego. It would have been an easy pulling back of the veil, because it was already kind of transparent to begin with. For modern minds who are very much in their ego, it can be very dramatic, very hard to let go. And this is why people have difficult journeys. But what's going on is there is this being that's there in place of the ego. The ego does get dissolved uh, in the time of that, and you can see the similar thing with dreaming at night. When you're dreaming at night, you're not really there. The ego's not there. There's stuff going on. It's really more astral, but the ego leaves the body at night. And in the dream, you're not really aware of what's going on, unless you're doing lucid dreaming, and that's more of an advanced state where you're actually aware that you're in the dream, and that's desirable to advance that way. But for most part, people, they're not aware in the dream, and then afterwards they might remember it and they can review it from the place of ego awareness. But with the shamanistic practice of administering psychoactive substances, another being comes in, and they kind of like start opening the drawer in your memory bank. You're going, oh yeah, you got something stuffed in the back of that drawer. Let's pull that out. Remember that? Totally forgot I had that in there. Whoa, that's scary. It's really stinky. Yeah, like you haven't really been cleaning your closet very often. And if that's what you want, that's great. But it does involve the ego being dissolved. And there's still a time and place for that. I did that, and it awoke me to different things to work on. I got some homework assignments and whatnot. But the thing is, with the ego, it allows us to be present, to make choices, to be involved, and to put will into what's going on in terms of the transformation and the alchemy and so forth. And this is where Neo-Shamanism really needs to allow for the presence of the ego to be involved, rather than just some plant spirit agent that's there. Because, and I've seen, a number of cases where people did heavy doses of things and they didn't come back. Dissolve their ego, and that could be a long-term condition they have to live with. And maybe you've seen people too where it changed them not for the better. They left and they didn't come back to the house. The lights are on, but nobody's home.
What happened then?
The ego is dissolved, or it's ejected out, taken out. This thing comes in place of the self, and they have a hard time getting back into the body and into the senses. There may have been something too intense in the journey that has traumatized them, and so they actually don't want to come back to Earth. So, I had my own experience with that. This has to be held very carefully by a trained shaman who administers not only the substance, but is working with the beings, and then at the end removes it. There has to be that kind of hygiene where it's taken out of you as well. And I've seen cases where that's not being done. That's not even a consideration, that the plant spirit being is taken out of you and you have your house to yourself again. Whether it's something kind of in the background that's there craving more of itself, these things, they're amoral. They're amoral. They don't really have a set morality. They just do their function, and they'll just stay there if you let them. So, and it can become parasitical even at one extreme. So really having a trained shaman that knows what they're doing to administer and remove it, to have the right kind of container is very important. Now, having said that, with Neo-Shamanism and even the ancient shamanism, you didn't have to take substances necessarily. Shamanism isn't equated with psychoactive substances. It's equated with an altered state of consciousness, which can be administered through music and other things. But with neo-shamanism, really the point is that the ego needs to be more present and more active in its own evolution and its own experiences. So it's exercising its freedom of will and choices and participating. This is why I got this book out here, DMT, Spirit Molecule. And I'm not sure if it's this one. Yeah, I guess it's this one where Dr. Rick Strassman, who got the license to administer DMT to several hundred people. I don't know, this is going back 10 or 15 years down in the States. And people had incredible openings, of course. But then he interviewed them a year or two later. And despite the fact that they had things blown open, a lot of them were still stuck in lousy relationships. They hadn't moved out of stagnant careers. You know, the things that they were dealing with on this level hadn't changed, even though they had, fireworks going off for, 10, 15 minutes. The veil pulled back, seeing things. Unless the ego is involved in its own evolution as a self-stylizing, evolutionary, loving fashionista, then these things really aren't benefiting and can even be counterproductive in a way, kind of like cheating. It's like, I just want to see it, but I don't have to do any work. Right? So we're now with this modern mindset where we can definitely be, more analytical about our lives, more objective about our lives, more involved in our lives. Oh, just to kind of continue, your question about what's happening there with, the ego going out. This was an important point I made in the class about how the ego is not only functional with its functions, and we looked at about, 15 different functions of the ego, because it's not just this problem, it's got functions like identity and choice and so forth, but it's also corporeal, which means it is a body. And this fits really with the Eastern spiritual perspective that we were made up of bodies, like one of those Russian dolls, nesting dolls. Koshas, they're called koshas, the physical kosha, the Annamaya kosha, and so forth. And the ego self nests in the center of this. And as a body, if it's taken out and can't get back in, it's an incarnation issue. And I think that's like up at the top of the list with people's problems these days, be them physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, as they're not really incarnated in their body. They're not really in it. They're kind of floating around, and doing a lot of biochemical tweaking of this and that. But, our modern Western educational system hasn't really developed the will. I think Western people are very weak-willed, and we're relying on other people to do things for us, tell us what to do, give us something that's going to fix us. For all we've got, we're actually have a weakening of the will that's taking place, and that's going to lead to incarnation issues, that you're not really in your body. And this is the neo-shamanism. It's not necessarily about always getting out, but coming in, to come in and through the mind and the body. And this is why we talked about how, thinking is part of the new spiritual path, to have your own mind, which the primitive people didn't. They shared their mind with each other and with nature. Now we're individuating. You have your own mind, your own thoughts, your own will, your own iPhone, your own PC, personal computer, your own PIN number, SIN number. We're all individuating. And so we have to claim that. We have to take a hold of that. It's not the end of the destination. It's not this isn't the destiny just to be what I call a unicellular being. We start off as a unicellular being, and now we're unicellular just to ourselves. But to work with the mind instead of just trying to get out of the mind is part of the new path. And this is why I kind of hit on Osho a little bit, because we looked at a dissertation that Osho gave when one of his followers asked him a question, saying that he'd been raised with the work of Rudolf Steiner, and then now he was listening to Osho and he was feeling torn because there seemed to be discrepancy. And then Osho, he really gives this thing about getting rid of the ego, stop thinking. Thinking creates tension. Get out of your mind, let that all go and connect with the original mind, which is, there's elements of truth from the earlier periods that those things were good practices. But Rudolf Steiner, which Osho said was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, but then goes to berate Rudolf Steiner and say, that's all he is. He's just a mind, and we need to get rid of the mind. So blah. Kind of blew him off. But I think it kind of blew off Osho and a lot of his hypocrisy and dangerous statements. And this is part of the problem is holding on to religious perspectives and practices that were relevant and applicable and supportive in an earlier time. But that's like keeping people in grade 1 when really they need a curriculum for grade 5 or high school or university. And it's acknowledging this spiritual evolution that's been taking place. But that's the other book. So in the second half, moving now towards this question of the Christ archetype, and we'll tie that back into some of the things we've covered. I want to pick up, the thing of Carl Jung, who really was working with this word archetype and made an association between the Christ and the self. And he does that in this compilation of his work called Ion, which we'll talk about in a moment. But Jung, personally, he was very familiar with religion. His father was a minister. His grandfathers on both sides were ministers. 8 of his uncles were ministers and 2 of his cousins. So can only imagine what family dinners were like, talking about religion. So he was no stranger to religion, but that wasn't his interest. He wasn't trying to put forward some sort of theology. He actually moved away from that. He was working with Freud, who was Jewish, and neither of them were really interested in the religiosity or the theology of things. They were at a time and a place where, science was growing, and they were trying to fit in with, the new sciences of biology and chemistry and physics. And they were bringing this science of psychology of the mind. And so it wasn't at all about, the religious aspect, but how the mind worked and how these religious images, or any kind of image, any kind of symbol, really is an external representation of a part of you. That's what an archetype is. It's really part of the architecture of your inner makeup. And that can be a character, we could talk about the archetype of the mother, or the archetype of the witch, or the archetype of the jester, or the archetype of death, as a theme, or the archetype of, rebirth. So these are all archetypal themes that make up the grand architecture of life, both externally and internally. So Jung was really looking at this external figure of the Christ as an archetype that represented the self, that it was something that represented the self. And he referred to it by the name Ion, which is a Roman god for time. We sometimes use the word eon, but he spelt it differently. So Ion is where he speaks about this Christ archetype as a symbol of the self. And so, how is it that the god of time correlates to this Christ figure? And again, we're not getting into whether, there was historical Jesus or not. That's not really something we have to consider. We're really trying to be kind of trans history a little bit here. But he was seeing how the Christ represented this principle, really, that was a representation of the whole self that would come into manifestation through time and through space, space moving through time, that the self would rise to this level of consciousness that the Christ represented. And so the Christ was not so much a religious figure, but actually an evolutionary force, represented an evolutionary force of how we're all evolving through time to come to a state of a whole balanced self, which is really what he was working towards as a psychologist, support people to be balanced and whole. So just a bit of my background, a little tangent here, is that I had a lot of interest in my 20s in religion and in the study of the scriptures and whatnot. I shared a bit of this last week, how I had kind of a psychotic break at age 20, a little bit too much of and messing around with energies. And I thought I was Jesus reincarnated, come back, second coming to save the world. Hallelujah. Here I am. Thank you very much. Take a bow. No, you take a bow, not me. So, that was actually, a good thing in a way, because it really opened up a huge question as like, what was that? And I serendipitously got connected to this group that was very much into biblical research and teaching, and spent most of my 20s involved with this group, taking many, many courses and going to conferences. I actually went and did some of the training at a college down in Kansas for a year. And I was learning, to read the original languages, the Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew and things like that, as part of this training I was doing. And so I learned a lot of what's in the Bible, and it's pretty amazing what's in there. I mean, I actually have brought it out, my study Bible that I used during those times with all my notes and whatnot. And it's a complex book. It's made up of 50 some odd books that are put into one binding. So I had some really interesting times digging through it to see what's inside this book that has obviously had a very huge cultural impact on Western culture. And so, it's good because people start saying, oh, the Bible says this. And it's like, no, it doesn't. I know it's in the Bible, and the Bible does not say that. So people try to, pin things on the Bible, and it's like, not with me, you don't. But, what really was exciting was then I kind of moved on from that. And then in my 30s, I got introduced to Jung because my sister was doing psychoanalysis with a Jungian analyst, and she started talking about it. And so I did the deep dive with him and started to understand how much of what's written in the Bible is archetypes, stories. There's many, many stories, many different figures. You don't necessarily have to get hung up on whether this is factual or fictional, because they still have power. They still have power as archetypes, just like images in your dreams have power. to move you, or images outside of you. They have power to move you. So that was my kind of the next step in my initiation, to take all the knowledge that I had gained from those studies and to recontextualize it within Jung's work. And that's helped me to understand, more of the Abrahamic religions of Judaism and Islam and Christianity, which are sometimes called churchianity, because it's, these things get built up as human institutions. But it's good to know that each one of these Abrahamic religions also has their mystical side that goes deeper than just, taking these texts literally. So, Judaism has Kabbalah, and Islam has Sufism, and Christianity has, different mystical streams like Rosicrucianism, or the Knights Templars, or the Cathars, and so forth. So, I just say that so you realize we shouldn't necessarily throw these things out as we're kind of doing in our secular culture. It's like, oh, these old religions, are dead and of no value. But when you realize, oh no, these stories have archetypal power because they're portraits. Like when I read the stories, in the book of Exodus and Genesis and so forth, it's like it's really describing my own inner struggle to be free from slavery, And we're going to look at that right now about Moses, and the call he had to take the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And this brings us to the this image of the burning bush. There's a book I've got called The Burning Bush, written by a spiritual scientist. So he's looking at the images in the Old Testament from more of an archetypal and mystical and psychological perspective. So yeah, this image of Moses as a patriarch to the Hebrew people when they were in slavery in Egypt, and how he actually escaped himself and went off and just lived raising sheep. And one day, one of his sheep wandered off, so he went looking for it and came across this burning bush. And the burning bush was not consuming; it was just burning and burning and burning. It didn't burn up. And it called to him, Moses, 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 get over here. It's like, what? What's going on here? And this burning bush says, I'm commissioning you to go and to lead the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And it's like, the story goes, it's like back and forth. Are you kidding? I'm having a good time here with my wife and sheep. It's like, no. Okay, so Moses finally realizes he's having a conversation with, something higher than himself. And he says, all right, okay, I'm going to go back to all these cranky Hebrew people. Who am I going to tell them is asked me to do this? And the burning bush said, I am that I am. Tell them that I am sent you. I am. And I think that is so cool. Here, this being, which, could be associated with Jehovah or Yahweh, really, in Judaism, they think of it as, you don't name God because God's nameless. You can't actually name God. So the burning bush identifies as I am, really something of unawake, aware consciousness, the consciousness of the universe. You could say the creative consciousness is saying, I am. That's how he identified. So now, if we move forward now to Jesus and Christ, the other thing Osho, in that dissertation that we looked at, and the link is there on our Google Doc. You can look it up. It's easy to find. It's like 12 pages of him talking. And we didn't address that, but he gets into Steiner's view of the Christ. And so I want to bring that in a little bit because Osho talked about how Steiner believes that Jesus and Christ were two different beings. And this is true. And that's a huge thing, that Jesus and Christ are not the same beings. But I need to back up a little bit here first, because so we had the burning bush identifying as I am, and then in the Gospels, when the heat was on at a particular time for Jesus, they were pressing him, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" Because there was all these claims that he was making, being circulated around, that he was claiming to be the King of the Jews and the Messiah and things like that. And in the Gospel of John, he says, "I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am." So Jesus, this is after he turned 30 and he was out doing the work. He was identifying himself also with this I am cosmic consciousness, that he was an embodiment of this cosmic consciousness, sometimes referred to as the Christ consciousness. And so how did that come about? So as I said, in Steiner's view, and we're going to look at Steiner's view a little bit, and he is different than Jung because he does believe this was a historical thing on the physical level, but there was a person, Jesus, and that, apart from some of the stuff that's kind of legend and myth, that these events actually did take place on the physical level, and they needed to. Because as we've been saying, evolution of consciousness means coming from a spiritual state into a physical state and then returning back to a spiritual state. And so these events had to take place eventually on the physical plane. I have a book here called Jesus the Egyptian: The Origins of Christianity and the Psychology of Christ. And you may have already come across things on the internet and people saying, "Oh, well, the people in Christianity, Jesus and whatnot, were just co-opted from the Egyptian mythology." And it's true that, a lot of things, Egyptian spirituality, in some ways, is the source of a lot of these other things that came after it, including the mystical traditions of Sufism and Kabbalah and mystical Christianity. So for sure, things have flowed from Egypt into more modern forms of spirituality. In fact, Steiner, he makes a comment where he says Egypt inherited an even older spiritual tradition from India. So he points back even pre-Egyptian, and you can see that, and I see that, and I'll be writing about that in my other book on cosmic GPS, on how you can see India and Egypt, because Egypt, like, all of a sudden at the first dynasties, blossomed with all this incredible spiritual knowledge. Like, where did that come from? It came from somewhere. So it was inherited from the past. But people often say that, oh, well, Jesus was just kind of a conflation of Osiris and Horus, and Mary is just Isis kind of repackaged. The Romans took the Egyptian mythology and kind of humanized it more, and then in the 4th century made Christianity the official religion of Rome. But Steiner says, no, like, yeah, for sure, some of these things were more legend and myth, and you could say archetypes, but he says this eventually came to Earth in actual historical events. So that's his stance. So now the whole thing around the difference between Jesus and Christ being different beings, that Jesus was a man, and like his blood lineage is recorded in the Bible, and it's those traditions were interested in your lineage, and that he was the descendant of King David, the house of David. So sometimes is referred to as the Son of Man, like kind of the Son of Man. And the word son doesn't really point so much to gender, like as boy. In the Bible, son refers to begotten, that Jesus was begotten of man, whereas Christ was not a man. Christ was of a higher nature, and so that's why is referred to as the Son of God, or the begotten of God. He was begotten of the cosmic intelligence. So Jesus and Christ, Son of Man, Son of God. And this coming together embodiment, sometimes referred to as the incarnation of something into the body, took place in stages. And you can see the gradual elevation of consciousness in Jesus as there was a gradual embodiment of this higher nature, the Christ. And there's this event at age 12 where Mary and Joseph had to go to Jerusalem for a census. They had to go and like they were taking a census of the people. And Jesus all of a sudden wasn't there, and they're looking for him. And they go and find him in the temple talking with the elders and the spiritual teachers, wisdom. And they're like kind of flabbergasted, like, how's this 12-year-old boy talking like this? And they kind of say, well, you took off without us. And he says, don't you know I must be about my Father's business? Like at that age, he recognized that, something of who he was or what was coming. And at that age, 12, 13, and, because he was Jewish, and then the Jewish tradition, that's when people have a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. It's a stage of coming of age. And so there was that step forward for Jesus at that time. The next step was at the baptism. This was like around the age of 30. So he actually did a bunch of training. He was with the Essenes doing training and discipline and purification and these sorts of things. And he might have gone to India. There's indications of that. But then at age 30, this meeting with John the Baptist, and this really began a whole nother phase where, if you're familiar with the image in the Gospels about how it says, a Holy Spirit dove descended upon him, and there was the voice of God saying, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. So the Son, again, is something being begotten into Jesus, something of the higher nature descending into what has ascended in a way. So Jesus, the man, and Christ of a higher nature come even closer together. Then there's another event where Jesus takes some of his disciples, like Peter and John and one other, up into the mountains. This is referred to as the Transfiguration, where they all of a sudden witness this transfiguration in the aura of Jesus up in the mountains. And there's actually the presence of Elijah. Some of the prophets are appearing there in spirit as part of this momentous occasion where the Christ is coming in even more into the man Jesus. Right? You with me so far? These are steps on the road that really also represent something of our own initiation and stages. Initiation is in stages. And then the next thing is the crucifixion itself, where, from an external viewpoint, looks like people grabbed them, said, you're saying bad things, you're being blasphemous, we got to crucify you, and they hung him up, and so he would die. But that's kind of an exoteric or external way of looking at it, because Jesus was telling his disciples all along, I'm going to die, and this needs to happen. And at one point, Peter's going, no, don't leave us, don't. And Jesus rebukes him quite severely and says, get thee behind me, Satan. Because what Peter was saying was actually going against what was predestined. That there was a plan, a predestined plan that involved the death of Jesus. We'll get to it in a moment. But, you can see, even Judas had to do what he had to do. This was all part of the plan. Jesus told Judas, go and do what you have to do, which ended up leading for him to be taken away and crucified. And he also explained this to his disciple by using the metaphor of a seed. He said, don't you know that, unless a seed is planted in the ground and dies, it will not be able to bear fruit. And that's, a wonderful metaphor of nature, that, there has to be a death of the lower, of that which, has not moved and grown and towards fulfilling its destiny. And so, for Jesus to continue in his initiation, he knew that death, a physical death, was required, but not only a physical death. As we said, physical things parallel and facilitate spiritual consciousness and spiritual evolution. So Jesus was also having to experience ego death. Yeah, just like we're all looking for and wondering what that is. So on the cross, one of the last words that he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Very strange words, but when you understand it from a mystical perspective, you realize that was just the last thing that the man, the ego of the man Jesus, experienced before his ego was extinguished.
But that was the ego?
That was the man ego of Jesus, had to die, experiencing that he was like being forsaken, that he was to die. So this was an ego death taking place on the cross, along with this physical death. And then the very last words he says is, it is finished. What is finished? Well, what he said at age 12. Don't you know I need to be about my Father's business? He finished it as a man going through this ego death. So, but what actually caused the death? Was it like the Jews grabbing him and taking him to Pilate and Herod and all that? No. It was actually the Christ that caused the death of Jesus. It was this higher nature descending down, coming closer and closer to the physical nature, that extinguished the ego and a physical death. Why? So there could be then a transformation right down to the physical level. This is why Steiner says it had to be a physical thing, so that even right down to the physical atomic level, after 3 days and 3 nights, rose again in a higher nature that had these different powers to appear and disappear and appear in different places at once and so forth. Because what had come to the lowest point physically, and this is why I get out this biography chart from time to time, and how age 33, which is when Jesus Christ was crucified, is really the lowest point in matter in your biography. You're deepest in the material world. So Jesus was deep in it, but then went in a new form, higher nature, where the Christ, the higher being, and the human nature became amalgamated. If you really want to go deeper in this rabbit hole, like Rudolf Steiner has a very interesting take on all of this, and lectured and spoke of this stuff extensively to bring out a mystical understanding of all these things, of what these religions are talking about, and what this whole mystery of Christianity is about, outside of churchianity. And so, I mean, even during those 3 days and 3 nights, if you look at the story in the Gospels, that the Christ descended even into subhuman planes, like even lower. He went from the lowest dimension, and then with this resurrection, this rebirth, with the new nature, which we're all evolving towards, it is an archetype of what we're evolving towards as a destiny and destination, connecting the lowest with the highest dimensions, because he came from the highest dimensions. He was the I am embodied and making a connection, building the bridge, which is what the older traditions of the guru did. I'll talk about that again in a moment. How this is sort of an advancement of the guru disciple relationship. I also wanted to just take a moment to point out an interesting fun fact, if you will, about the origin of the word Christ. It comes from the Greek Christos, but the Greeks got it from the Egyptians. No surprise. The hieroglyph K-R-S-T, Christ. And they leave out the vowels. The vowels are implied. But Christ refers really to an anointed mummy. Christ refers to an anointed dead body that's been mummified. And I do a whole chapter in my Cosmic GPS book on mummification because it's really important to understand it the right way. And often Egyptologists don't really portray the mystical aspect of what's going on with mummification, but it's very important to see that. So, the body of Jesus was anointed and in a way mummified. He was wrapped in this shroud and so forth. Because a body that's preserved that way, well, let me finish with the etymology of the word. The word Christ, if you put in the vowels, it's karast. So ka, which is the life body in Egyptian terminology, ka, and rist, or rast, means risen or rise. Ka is risen, rise. So it's the rise of life. And so mummification, which in the Egyptian story, the first one mummy was Osiris. Osiris was the first mummy, and Osiris, rose and lives in the other world, the Duat, and is there as a guide. And any pharaoh that goes through initiation dies and is mummified, then he's joined with Osiris. But then these, through the mummy, support life on earth. It flows on a two-way street. It's not like just leaving. It's like, oh, something actually flows back to support the spiritual life on earth through these mummified beings, these Christ, Charist beings. And so, in a way, the Christ, via this whole thing of Jesus, becomes, he's called the Christ to indicate that he was the anointed and really the appointed one to be that bridge from the lowest levels back up to the highest levels. And that's what the next step in the story is about, called the ascension, right? After the resurrection, Jesus is around for 40 days and showing himself and going, look, this is what it's about. This is the future. And then he ascends. What is that? He then leaves this dimension and moves back up into higher dimensions. He ascends back up into higher dimensions, becoming really that bridge for humans through the dimensions. Now, moving out of the gospel stories, we have to then go to the next part of the Bible, the epistles written largely by Paul, which are letters that he wrote and circulated around to the fledgling Christian communities in the first century. This was before Christianity became an official religion of the state of Rome. And Paul, he was a well-educated Jewish leader, part of the Sanhedrin, the leading body, and he was traveling on the road to Damascus to persecute this new religion, this new upstart religion, and to even kill Christians. He wanted to extinguish it. But then he has this experience where he's blinded. He's blinded for 3 days and 3 nights, and then has all these epiphanies and revelations about this cosmic consciousness that has entered the Earth's evolution through this event in Jesus and is given revelations that he says have never been given to humanity before. This is in his epistles, in the epistle to the Ephesians in particular. He talks about the great mystery. Paul wrote the epistles. So he wasn't one of the disciples. He never met Jesus physically. This all happened through spiritual encounter on the road to Damascus. And given this, what he called the great mystery that had never been revealed to humanity before. You might think, well, how can that be? Like, it's all there. Like, can't we just access the spiritual information anywhere all the time? But no, if we really consider this idea of spiritual evolution and the evolution of consciousness, things happen at a certain time and place in linear time when humanity is ready and mature enough to receive it. And this whole event, which Steiner calls the mystery of Golgotha, because this is where Jesus was crucified at the rock of Golgotha. This mystery of Golgotha took place during the Greek civilization, the Greek-Roman civilization, when humanity was ready in terms of their ego maturation, to receive this new evolutionary impulse and the new revelation, which Paul, being Jewish, all of a sudden became Christian and started promoting, this new revelation and the great mystery, which he writes about. And this new mystery talks about the one body. And we've been talking about this in the class of how, things that are, seem so separated on this level, but really they should be unified. Well, they are separated on this level, but Paul's talking about coming in the future is really a new form of unity through a unity consciousness, and not just a unity. It's like, oh yeah, well, we're all, Canadians, so that unites us, or, we're all Asians, so, that's what unites us, or we're all males, so, that's what, no, he's talking about a spiritual unity, which is the great mystery. In particular, he was saying that the segregation between Jews and Gentiles was over, and that there had been a segregation for a time, and it served a purpose, and that was something that had ended with kind of a new administration, a new spiritual administration, and that was at the end. And the thing that was to unite people, which he called the riches of the glory of the mystery, was the fact that now it's Christ in you, the Christ in you. This, we can just call it the cosmic consciousness, is now in you. It's in the earth. And that's what the ascension was about, was that the Christ was no longer in one body, but is now become part of the body of the earth. This new evolutionary impulse now exists in the earth. And that's the thing that's going to unite us, is this new consciousness. And so, Paul also makes references. He says, not I, not just my little ego, not I, but Christ in me, this higher nature. And we have to get rid of, this idea. I'm not trying to promote some sort of religious doctrine here. This is science. This is spiritual science talking about the evolution of consciousness and what has facilitated it through linear time. And then now it starts to make sense of, these different religious streams and what they've been working to facilitate here on Earth. And so, yeah, there's this new power now, new power of consciousness that's in the environment that wasn't there before. And we were talking about environment in the class and how important that is for the ego, for your own I am awareness to be in a healthy environment. And we're not only talking about like the environment, like forests and fields and what's outside, but that's important and contributes. But the environment of your mind, the environment of the mind is really the nest in which this seed ego is going to be able to grow up into its destination and destiny as a full I am being that can then unite with the rest of the collective consciousness and connect, with the higher consciousness. So this is why we're talking about a new spirituality. Well, you need to become active in your ego. You need to be active in your ego. You need to be active in your mind. You need to be active in your thoughts and feelings. You don't want to abandon them and vacate them, which is part of what the old shamanism is about. You get out of the way and you let a plant spirit agent come in and pull the controls and work things for you. We can't rely on that going into the future. We can still utilize those things, and I have. I did a series of mushroom journeys last year and woke some things up, woke and shook up some things, and that's great. And then it's like, okay, I've had enough of that. Now I've got homework, and now I have to be active in my will and my ego, making choices. And most importantly of all is moral activity. This is really central to the ego's development, is our moral activity. And we're being tested morally every day in the choices that we make as to whether we can really embody something of this higher nature. So in doing that, Paul gives kind of a formula. He gives this formula, which he calls the renewed mind. Like, this is the way to move forward, is actually to renew your mind. It's like this thing that you have, right? You live with your mind every day, and you may hate the thoughts in your mind. You might find there's lots of trauma there, there's bruises and things like that. But that's what you've got to work with. And he talks about the renewing of their mind is two steps. First of all, putting off the old ways of the old nature, which is corrupt and subject to, all the seductions and trickery of the world and Maya. And then you put on the new mind. You put on new thoughts. And isn't that wonderful that you can actually determine through ego activity, moral activity, what kind of thoughts you hold and feed yourself with? Because that's what we build our spirit with. We're building our spirit through our thought life and how we digest. I was talking about ingestion, digestion, elimination, assimilation of experiences in our life, which is why doing the Rukshow exercise, a review of your day backwards each day, is helping you to digest and assimilate information that's in the environment to build your spirit. It's now up to us to be, I am aware, and I am aware of what I'm putting into my mind as well as what I'm putting into my body. And to avoid what one of the prophets in the Old Testament referred to as strange fires. There was the sons of Aaron who were messing around, making offerings to wrong gods and idolatry and things like that. And it's referred to as strange fires, and they actually became consumed themselves and extinguished by, working with strange fires rather than sacred fires. This is the choices we have. Are you going to mess around with strange fires and thought viruses and off the wall conspiracy theories and things like that? It's not going to build your spirit with, eternal brick and mortar that you're going to have when you die. What you build yourself is what you're going to have after you die, and you're going to have to look at it after you die. So we want to avoid strange fires, work with sacred fires, which is what illumination is all about. Illumination is about igniting cosmic fire and cosmic consciousness within us. And that's what the Egyptians were doing in their initiations in the temples and the pyramids. Pyramid actually means pyramid, fire in the middle. They were working with their initiations to ignite this cosmic consciousness within their own being through the temple initiations. So I'm kind of coming down to the end here, but one of the most important things to recognize out of all of this is how, as we do this work, coming from this core impulse of self-awareness in the ego and how that builds the spiritual self, and we work with the contents of our mind and how that impacts the physical world, the ego is not a problem, but it's actually the hope. It's actually the hope of the world. We are the hope of the world. Humans hold hope. We have the power. And the reason why we are the hope of the world is because, as Jesus put it, we are the light of the world. We are the lights of the world. He said that. Either that's, just hukum or it's the truth. That we have as our destiny and destination to be the lights of the world. And the neat thing about light is the physical body needs physical light. We need to receive physical light to sustain our physical nature. It's the opposite with the ego. The ego needs to give light. It needs to give light to sustain itself. So it's the practice of recognizing you hold light within you as you align with this Christ cosmic consciousness that's now in the etheric dimension of the world. It's there. You can attune to it. You can change your mind to align with it and turn on the light of illumination within yourself and shine it out to be hope to the world as a light of the world, avoiding the strange fires of egotism and narcissism and igniting the sacred fire just as it was in the burning bush. But it's no longer outside of you in a burning bush. It's now inside of you. And to live more by that light rather than the light of other things. And this was something I learned in my mushroom ceremonies last year, was I was living by the light of other people. I was living by the light of women and things outside of myself. But that's moonlight. You're taking reflective light rather than direct light when you live by the light of other things that are just reflecting light. It's like living by moonlight, but we should be going to the source, sunlight, and ignite it within ourselves and give it out. That's what's going to make us healthy and sustain our consciousness. And that will lead to this collective one body, one mind, one love that Paul talks about in his epistles, which is really a new Neo-Shamanism, and you could even call it a Neo-Tribalism. A new tribalism collective. Any questions?
Yes.
Ooh, please.